Hey guys, so let's talk about international trade, specifically why countries and people trade with each other, and what a couple basic models that explain possible trade patterns. I'll be using the board behind my back to do some calculations. Hopefully, you'll be able to see everything. If not, just shoot me an email, let me know. But one of the biggest questions with trade is that we typically say that trade can benefit everybody. And this is where a lot of people raise an issue saying that if everybody, countries, individuals, societies are limited by the production possibility frontiers, how is it possible to have that situation where we do kind of two individuals trading with each other benefit as a result of that both? Isn't it kind of a zero-sum game where you take from one and give it to another, where only one benefits? Well, here's the deal, something you need to keep in mind. The kind of trade that we're talking about is a voluntary trade. So that's the trade relationship that you enter at your own free will. And I guess if you weren't benefiting from it, then the question is, what is there that makes you enter into that relationship? So there are multiple trade models. Easily we're looking at a couple dozen distinct trade theories, even more with variations. And some of them look into describing trade based on resource endowments. Some of them are based on productivities. Some are even based on consumer tastes. But today we're going to focus on two of the oldest and the most basic trade models, comparative and absolute advantage. So let's start with a simple thought about what makes trade so beneficial. We start with the fact that even though we are all limited by our PPFs, technically we probably can produce everything from food that we need to consume to clothes that we want to wear. We can fix our own cars and potentially even make our own cars. Of course, that will take significantly more effort. But if you ever thought about putting yourself into that position where you have to make everything that you consume, you probably figured out that with only 24 hours a day, you'll have to be walking around butt naked. You'll be pretty skinny, and it's unlikely that you'll be able to drive around because it'll probably take you 15, 20 years to make a car. And that's why the key thing here is that we can benefit from trade if we specialize. So that word specialization is the key word in pretty much everything when it comes to explaining benefits from trade, when it comes to explaining a lot of stuff in economics. Think Henry Ford, right? He became famous basically because he came up with this idea of an assembly line which allowed his Model T to be assembled in numbers previously unseen from any automaker in the country, in the world for that matter. Well, here's the deal. The reason he was able to get that was because he forced his workers to specialize. So instead of having a single worker do pretty much every single operation at assembling a car, he now had an assembly line where every worker was highly trained and highly specialized at doing that one particular task. May not have been a lot of things, but that worker was extremely fast and extremely good at doing that. In the end, he increased the speed of making those vehicles significantly and lowered the cost of making those vehicles as well. So, if we look into the idea of specialization, then we can get to this point that everybody can gain from trade because we can all specialize in something that we're good at. I can fix my own car, I can cook my own food, and I cook sometimes, and I fix a few things on the car here and there, but I choose to teach economics, where I think I'm a little more productive than in other things, and as a result of that, I can earn the money and then use that money to pay somebody who fixes my car or go out and eat when I don't feel like cooking. So because of this, because of specialization, I actually have a car that I can drive and I'm not hungry. In fact, I probably can use to lose a few pounds, but that's another story. So, how do we measure benefits from trade? Well, we look at what can a country or an individual consume without trade and compare it to what can be consumed with the trade. And in the end of this discussion, I will show you an example how we can use the simple numbers and actually see that two countries can in fact benefit from trade. So, I guess we've established that with specialization and trade, everybody can benefit. The next question is, if two individuals or two countries or two societies in general, if they do decide to trade, how are they going to do it? How do they figure out who specializes in what? How do they figure out what prices the goods should be sold at, etc.? As I said, there are about 25 different models of that, but let's look at the oldest one, and we're going to look at it through an example. So here's an example where we have two hypothetical countries. I have Germany that can produce either 20 barrels of beer or 10 gallons of wine in 1 hour, and I have France that can produce either 15 barrels of beer or 20 gallons of wine in an hour. So quality aside, right, there's no doubt that German beer beats the crap out of French beer, and French beer beats the hell out of and the French wine beats the hell out of German wine. If these two countries were to trade with each other, which should be specializing in producing wine, and which should be specializing in producing beer? I'll give you a moment to think about this, but you probably knew the answer even before I finished. Take a look at the output numbers. Both countries have 1 hour, and Germany can produce 20 barrels of beer in that hour, whereas France can produce 15 barrels of beer in an hour. Since Germany seems to be more productive at beer than France, I guess it will only be reasonable that Germany should focus on the production of beer. And then let's take a look at the wine. In the same 1 hour, the French can produce 20 gallons of wine, whereas the Germans can only produce 10 gallons of wine. So again, it will only be reasonable to assume that in this situation, the French should focus on producing a wine, and the Germans should produce beer, simply based on who can produce more within the specific hour. So what we just described is the oldest and the most basic trade theory, the theory of absolute advantage. Based on this theory, what we do is we simply look at productivity. And we can ask the question either as who can produce more using the same amount of resources, or as who can produce the same amount of output while using less resources than the other. So in either case, we're looking at the productivity, and based on the productivity, we're saying that if we have the producer who can produce more using less resources, that producer has absolute advantage in the production of this particular good. Okay. Let's take a look at me. So I'm going to just try and use this board. Okay. So in our example, Germany has the absolute advantage in beer. France has the absolute advantage in wine. And this theory now tells us something pretty simple. It says Germany should produce beer, only beer and nothing but beer, and France should produce wine, only wine and nothing but wine, and then these two countries will trade with each other. Now, you may have noticed at this point there's a problem with what we call the complete specialization situation. Look at the markets, you definitely would see that there are German wines available for sale and there are French beers available for sale. Even with the other goods, we have pretty much the same situation. There is probably not a single country in the world that will specialize in all of the good, in just one of the good, I'm sorry. So there is no country that just produces one good and nothing else. Look at the parking lot. We have American cars, Japanese cars, European cars, there are Korean cars, and then there are American cars in all of those areas. So once people figured out that absolute advantage theory doesn't really work too well in this situation, they started looking at other possible issues with absolute advantage and thinking, what other theory can we come up with that will allow us to describe trade and may not suffer from the drawbacks of absolute advantage? So take a look at this example. I have another example here. Look, this seems like the same example that we just looked at. Really, the only thing I changed is just one number. Look at this, the productivity of France when it comes to wine, to beer. So now, if we got ourselves back to this example, right, back to this situation, we're looking at Germany that can produce 20 barrels of beer or 10 gallons of wine in an hour, same numbers as before. But we're looking at France that can produce 25 barrels of beer or 20 gallons of wine in an hour. So if we were trying to use the absolute advantage theory with these new numbers, the absolute advantage theory would tell us that France has the absolute advantage in beer because France can produce 25 barrels of beer in an hour and Germany can only make 20. France also has the absolute advantage in wine, same as before, 20 gallons an hour versus the German 10 gallons an hour. So France has absolute advantage in both. So the absolute advantage theory would tell France to produce both and do not trade with Germany at all. Basically saying that any more developed, more productive country should not be trading with any less developed, any less productive country at all, which of course is not the case. We do have a lot of situations where more advanced countries, more productive countries do trade with less productive countries and trade successfully. So the next theory, which is basically a spin-off of absolute advantage, comparative advantage theory, actually helps us resolve this particular situation. So there are two big issues with absolute advantage. First, it's that absolute advantage predicts complete specialization. So once you figured out your absolute advantage, you only produce that good and nothing else. And second, it is possible, like in our example here, it is possible to have absolute advantage in all goods. In which case, the absolute advantage theory completely fails at predicting how the trade pattern will work. In the next video, we're going to look at how the absolute advantage theory works, how the comparative advantage theory works, calculate comparative advantage, and predict the mutually beneficial terms of trade.